John Cordy, and I'm still waiting to find out what the twist was in The Sixth Sense. What was the twist? Obviously. Today I wanted to do a couple of different things, but it's Thursday, so we talk about kind of general modeler stuff rather than just specifically Helix or HX Stomp. So it's our opportunity to talk about things like Strymon Iridium, or things like the Hotone Ampera, and that is how I'm going to say that, or the Headrush Gig board. I think I'm going to get out today and do some stuff with. Next week, by the way of this, should be fairly interesting, hopefully. The main thing I wanted to talk about was full range flat response monitors. This is DB Technologies Flexis FM8. I've got two of these for actual use live, not with a modeler, just in a band. So, you know, like you'd have fold back monitors so you can hear what's going out front on stage. So this is just like a gigging small stage monitor, basically. I've also got some Yamaha DX 15s, which I use for the main front of house stuff. So I may bring in one of those and see if there's different kind of guidelines for using a bigger speaker. But hopefully I was going to try and do some stuff with this and give you some tips. So I'm going to play with this through today. It's like 6:30 in the morning at the moment while I'm filming this, and hopefully come up with some tips for how to get some good stuff out of an FRFR speaker. Any general tips, you know, if I was to go down this route. I know people have asked me to use an Iridium with an FRFR speaker, so I'll do that, because obviously you've got a little bit less flexibility in terms of like a global EQ or anything if you were using the Iridium into one of these. So before I get into my explorations and finding what I'm going to suggest with the full range flat response speaker, what I would first want to do is just talk about some sort of general ideas. You want to think about how you're going to position this. Is this going to be behind you like a guitar cab, or is it going to be in front of you like a monitor? There's kind of, that's the two ways you could do things, but obviously there's a massive difference between those. You know, a guitar amp behind you is the way we normally do things, right? So that's probably going to feel more comfortable, but I'm not sure that these throw out sound in the same way as a guitar amp. I'll do some experimenting and find out, so that's something to bear in mind. Another thing to bear in mind is if you've got potentially like two PA speakers behind you or in front of you or wherever, that's going to be chucking out potentially almost as much sound as what you've got going out front of house. So you have to consider whether you're kind of like being selfish and unbalancing the overall sound stage because of your monitoring setup, whatever that ends up being, particularly if it's in small venues and stuff, or if you're like in a pub band or something. If you've got two PA speakers, which is essentially what a full range flat response speaker ends up being, and it spreads sounds in a different way to what a normal guitar speaker might do. So that's something to bear in mind. Also, if you've got it coming back on stage in front of you, like a normal monitor, you have to bear in mind that that's potentially going to affect other people around you as well. You know, drummers or singers that might be in your proximity. I'd suggest to start with, we want to start with things flat on your speaker of choice, whatever it is. So have it set to the kind of flattest setting that you've got and start tweaking from there. The other thing I'll say is that this is probably our best opportunity for using global EQ. This is the reason that I wouldn't suggest using it for anything else, because when it comes to live use, that's actually where you want this to be able to kind of be a quick cure-all for any potential problems you might have, or kind of EQing to maybe a bright desk or a bright monitor or something like that, and just being able to make a quick tweak that will make a change over everything. That, to me, is what global EQ is for, not so much for kind of making micro tone adjustments on every patch. I think it's more for like once you get out live in the real world and on a gig situation, potentially that's when global EQ becomes most useful. So those are my kind of tips ahead of time. So think, are you having the monitor behind you or in front of you, and tweak with that setup in mind. Right, so the video's gone on a bit of a tangent given that my HX Stomp has decided to be a ghost today. Just plugged in the Iridium, and obviously we've got quite a lot less control with this, so I'm just going to quickly plug in and see what the initial sound is like. It's like nothing because I'm not plugged into anything. Cool. It's going well today, isn't it? So initially things at this volume, this is probably the same sort of volume that I'd have my monitors over there at anyway. Things sound fine, so keep your 4-inch flat response monitor level to start with. You know, if they've got like bass cuts or bass boosts, just leave all of that off to start with. Okay, so I'm turning things up a bit louder. Things still sound fine. I'm starting to hear a little bit of the character of the monitor speaker though coming through. I guess that is what's going to happen. Is there a way to avoid it with a small speaker like this? Probably not. So with the Iridium, I'm not having really any issue. Things sound pretty much as I'd expect. If I was playing through a real amp, I think there'd be a bit more of a low end kick, but I've only got an 8-inch speaker in this particular cab. Your experience may differ, but I think with the Iridium going into this, things sound fine to me. When you're at stage volume, I'm not sure how things. The thing with a monitor like this is you're going to have to be standing pretty much close to it and maybe even in front of it to get the full kind of weight of the sound. I think particularly stage monitors like this one are designed to kind of kick sound in a certain way that is not necessarily going to work massively well if you're not standing quite close to it and kind of on top of it. Things sound to me like I'd expect, you know, if I turn over to it, the Vox. If anything, I was expecting things to sound a little bit more boxy and a little bit thinner than they do, given that this is quite a cheap monitor. Also remember that generally you don't stand in front of your amp with it angled up towards you, pointing right in your face, so things are probably going to sound a little bit brighter. I think adjustments to that should probably be made separate to front of house, because you want your sound man to have control of the presence and all that kind of stuff, that if you could overcompensate for it, given that you're quite close to the speaker. So I'm going to try the Helix now and see if there's any difference, see if it's more difficult. We'll see what happens. Okay, so I'm having no trouble being inspired by the sounds that I'm hearing from this thing, so that's basically... So that's basically good news, I think. With this particular monitor, things are sounding roughly how I'd expect them to sound. Bear in mind that I've adjusted my presets on JBL LSR 305, so studio monitors that in theory should have a pretty flat response. The full range flat response is sounding how I would want my stuff to sound, I think. The temptation might be, once you sit 2 or 3 foot away from the speaker, that you want to tame off some high end and stuff, perhaps even more than you normally would relative to how you tweaked it in front of studio monitors. I would potentially caution you away from that, because on a stage, when you're competing with the highs of cymbals and stuff, as soon as you step away from that monitor and out of that kind of sweet spot, I don't know things might get super dark super quickly potentially. I was hoping that I'd be able to give you some kind of general tips and stuff, but my general tip is keep things as flat as possible. You know, don't have bass boosts and cuts and all that sort of stuff necessarily on the monitor, certainly to start with. Make your tweaking point and your starting point somewhere completely flat as possible. I may go and get the other speaker out of the car because this doesn't seem to really be presenting me too many problems. So this is my Yamaha DX R15, or one of them. These are what I use as PA speakers, by the way. So this is what I would use for playing like weddings and stuff. I specifically got the 15s because I wanted to not necessarily have to take subs out to my gigs. So I bought kind of a big speaker that would kick out quite a lot of bass. So let's see what happens. I'm going to set this up in roughly the same way as I did the smaller speaker and see if there's any difference. Okay, so again, that to me is sounding fine. I'll just talk through what's going on in the back bit at the moment. I think I've probably got things set to a relatively flat response. Okay, so I've got it on front of house main at the moment, so if I turn that off and I turn off the low cut, maybe we'll get a different kind of thing going on. Okay, so I'm still happy with how things are sounding. So I think my general tips are then, you're going to want to try and get in front of the speaker that you're going through and test things in the way that you're actually going to use them. So I'm not really sure whether I would like this live at the moment because I don't have a band to play with in context. So I can't say for sure whether things would sound good. The idea is that you're going to want to set things up how you're going to be playing with them, because at volume things are going to be different to in your bedroom or in your studio. My tip is to, if you're tweaking on headphones, I think maybe this would yield quite a different response to what I've got. So I run my Helix and Iridium and all that stuff through studio monitors, so I'm used to hearing a full range flat response kind of anyway. Main differences between the studio monitors and a PA speaker like these is maybe the distance between the tweeter and the main kind of speaker, quite different, or the main driver. So you're going to end up with like a separation of sound, whereas a studio monitor is designed to have that non-separation of sound at a close distance. A PA speaker is potentially going to sound less together. Start off with being able to use your global EQ if you needed to. for me right now, I don't feel like I would need to in this situation. Going into in-ear monitors, that is something that I've often had to do because things seem so much brighter when you've got in-ears. So maybe that's an advantage of like an actual monitor versus in-ears, is that you're going to have to make less adjustments potentially if they don't make everything sound super bright. I guess also part of this might come down to the quality of whatever speaker you're plugging into. If you plug into a junk speaker, things likely won't sound great. The other option on this side of things, I guess, would be to plug in front of a guitar speaker or into the effects return. But for me, if I was doing that, I might as well use the amp as well. So I would just run like a Helix or whatever, and the amp itself. So I've got a dual amp setup going on. So yeah, as I was saying, I think if you've got to take an amp, if you're taking an amp anyway for monitoring, to me it makes more sense to run that as like a dual amp setup, in my opinion. So I would run like a Helix. I would run delay, reverb and everything into the California Tweed or whatever amp I'm using, the Mark 5. But I'd also send that out to front of house in front of an amp model. So that's how I would do that. I guess for me, so if you've got things that aren't working so well live, let me know in the comments and I'll try and see if I can recreate these issues for a later video. I guess the question is, if you're going down the route of bringing your own kind of monitors and you've got to carry like a Helix or whatever device and two monitors as well, potentially, if you're running it in stereo for whatever reason, you're carrying quite a lot of gear to a gig. I think some people, they go down the modelling route because they want to kind of simplify. I don't think necessarily taking along a Helix and then a full PA speaker is necessarily the most simple route to go down, but potentially I think it could yield you some cool tones. I think what I've just heard, there's nothing wrong with what was going on to my ears. It sounded like 100% like what I could play through, so no negatives from that point of view, except for to carry around speakers this size. Potentially I could take the smaller monitor that I started off the video with, no problem really, because that is smaller than an amp even. But to cart around the DXR15 would not really be an option, particularly if I'm using that as front of house anyway. So a few considerations there. Is it simpler to just take an amp alongside whatever modelling device? Potentially will you get a better tone? Probably that's completely subjective, but I think for me, I do like the sound of having two amps and stuff. So yeah, like I say, if you've got things that you're struggling with in the FRFR department, please leave comments and I can try and see if I can recreate some of the issues. But for me, my patches are sounding how I would expect through these two particular monitors, so I'm not having any real issues. I think maybe that's down to how I set up my presets with studio monitors that are relatively flat as well, so maybe that's what's going on here. I also wanted to just answer a few questions that I'd asked for on Instagram, just to kind of give some general quick-fire like tips for any kind of modelling stuff, but I think I specifically asked about Helix. So there's any tips to give the Telecaster a warmer or fuller tone? In general, I think warmth in tones can be attributed to basically the presence of mids or not. If you're finding that your Telecaster sounds a bit thin, I would say turn the mids up. That would be my first. I was asked, do I ever use the HX Stomp with my amp in full cable method? I have experimented with it a bit for the channel. I've never done it live. I've used a Line 6 Pod HD 500 live in full cable method quite a while ago, but as yet the HX Stomp I've never taken out live in full cable method. I've tend to be going just direct or sending an out into the front of an amp, so it's on a separate signal path. so I've got like a dual amp kind of thing going on. The best way to volume level patches, I think there's something around this that's automatic in firmware 2.9. I'm not sure, but I would say that the best way to do it is in the scenario that you're actually going to be using those patches. So if you're playing with a band, with a drummer, through a PA system, balancing your patches at home in front of studio monitors or headphones is probably not the best way to go. I'd say that you probably want to be doing it in a rehearsal at least, especially in the modelling world. Volume on any guitar gets hum when rolled down. Got a problem with the HX Stomp. So I'd suggest this is probably a proximity issue, if it's not a guitar issue. Potentially you're sitting quite close to the monitors or something. So that'd be my first kind of thing. Are you sitting near a noise source? I've been asked Helix HX Stomp with pedals or Helix pedal board, as in which would I choose? And I'm not really sure, to be honest. I've just been doing videos with the Helix and the Dude at the moment, and I also did some with the Printed Tone, and I've got to say I think I prefer the response and feel of a real drive. So there's got to be something to be said for kind of the HX Stomp drive arrangement, although it's potentially, you know, a little bit of admin to set all that up and to get it all powered. If I had to choose between a Kemper or a Helix and HX Stomp, I think the answer is that you see me do it pretty much every day. So the HX Stomp or the Helix I use quite a lot more than my Kemper. Do I have a favourite Helix patch? I think at the moment it's my Eric combined patch, which has got like an Eric Johnson type clean and then a kind of Eric Johnson type lead. The first profile adjustment I would make when switching from a single coil to a humbucker guitar, I think minor adjustments, so slightly less gain might be a good one, and a slight reduction in the mids might be a good one. But the wider question is, so if you're switching guitars, probably you wanted a change in tone anyway. Why would you adjust that? Is my question. You know, if you've gone in the middle of a set to change from a Les Paul to a Stratocaster, presumably you did that for a tonal choice. So that I wouldn't be sure why. And I've been asked, how do I deal with hum from single coils when adding more gain to a patch? Well, I guess this is a similar kind of answer to before, but if you're getting crazy hum, then you're probably close to a source of noise. Admittedly, live there are quite a lot of sources of noise. But at the start of your signal chain, you could consider having a noise gate. They do change the response a little bit, but I think for quite a lot of my lead tones where I've got a bit of gain, I will happily stick on a noise gate. I need help. Helix LT or Moore 300? I would say Helix for me. I've not played a Moore 300, but the community of Helix is kind of bigger, and yeah, I think they'd support their product really well. So, and Jim has said Jazz Badger, Jazz Badgers, so I think I agree. I've also been asked, do I have patches for HX effects, and the answer to that is no. So those are some answers, some questions you had.